This weekend, thousands of people, including U.S. President Barack Obama, will gather in Selma, Alabama for the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. On March 7, 1965, Reverend Hosea Williams and now U.S. Congressman John Lewis led a group of 600 marchers towards Montgomery. The group was turned back by Alabama state troopers who beat them with nightsticks and tear gas. Weeks later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. set off again with thousands of marchers and successfully made the 86-kilometer journey from Selma to Montgomery. The demonstrations eventually resulted in the Voting Rights Act, legislation signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson that outlaws racial discrimination in voting. Joining us now to talk about this is Dory Ladner. She is a civil rights activist and Selma participant from California. We're joined by documentary photographer Stephen Sommerstein. He traveled with students from New York to photograph the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And also with us in Washington, D.C. in our studio is Avis Jones DeWeaver. She's president of the D.C.-based consulting firm Insight Unlimited and is the former executive director of the National Council of Negro Women. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Dory, you were part of those three marches way back in 1965. Civil rights, the fight for civil rights didn't start in Selma, but how big a turning point was this march at that time?
Well, it was a gradual build-up because coming from Mississippi, we were disenfranchised. We didn't have the right to vote, and I started at 14 years of age. And by the time we got to the 65 Voting Rights Act, a lot of momentum had been built up. I was one of the students on the ground risking my life to bring people to the polls to try and register to vote. And the 65 Voting Rights Act was something that we had been working towards for 6 or 7 years, and it culminated in Selma, Alabama.
Because what happened in Selma, Alabama was that it caught national and international attention, those marches, didn't they?
Yes. Well, it caught the attention because of the beating on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But we had been subjected to brutality and murders many years before then. I can count many people who were murdered and beaten. Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was testified before the Credentials Committee in Mississippi, from Mississippi Democratic Convention in 1964. We took a group of delegates to the Democratic Convention to try to be seated because we could not vote. And President Johnson at that time did not agree with us, so we were turned back. But this had been building up since around 61, 62.
Avis, there was a report produced by the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. This was a report produced by about several scholars, and it says the Voting Rights Act was the most significant action to overcome Southern suppression of black voters. What, in your view, has been the long-term impact of Selma in the passage of the Voting Rights Act?
Well, it broke the backs of the white primaries in the South, and so it provided an opportunity for citizens who had for so long been denied the full rights of citizenship to be able to exercise the franchise and be able to vote. To me, though, the real tragedy is that 50 years later, we're going down there to celebrate the passage of this act after those brave acts, but our rights are imperiled once again. So for every 2 steps forward, it seems we always ultimately fall back at least one more step.
Yes, of course. You're referring, of course, I imagine, to the setback that the Voting Rights Act suffered in 2013 at the U.S. Supreme Court when, according to the New York Times, the heart of the law was taken out.
It's been gutted, and exactly after the Supreme Court came down with their ruling, within minutes, frankly, you had actions begin to go underway in places like North Carolina and places like Texas and all over. And then when you culminate that with also other things that have been happening all around the nation in terms of felony disenfranchisement, in terms of voter ID requirements, you have millions today who have been disenfranchised. So it's time to do more than just march. It's time to continue to fight for correcting those actions because that blood was not spilt in vain.
Let's go to Stephen in California. Stephen, you were a young student in your 20s, in the 60s. We've been looking at your photographs. They're absolutely stunning photographs, very haunting photographs. How did you get to be on a bus traveling to Selma?
I was editor of my college newspaper at City College in New York. It was called Main Events, and we were well aware of the voting rights efforts. Many of our students had gone down and participated in Mississippi Summer, and we had done some small stories about it. we had watched what had happened at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. It had reached national news. And many of the students in the school were organizing to take up Dr. King's request to go on to the march, to continue to Montgomery. And I met with my editorial board, and we decided we were going to cover the march. And I went down there with one of my writers. I was the editor, but I was also the chief photographer. And we joined a City College group on one of the buses that left New York City from the Port Authority bus terminal. And at that point, you know, I had to start making my decisions on how the photography would go and how I would cover a march of which we did not know how it was going to turn out.
Dory, you know, talking about how the march turned out, what was the atmosphere like in Selma at the time during those marches? I mean, was it fraught with racial tension? And did you at any point, I mean, fear for your life?
If I may go back, I worked for SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and we were the young people that were referred to in this movie, Selma. We went into Alabama in 1962, Diane Nash and James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, and Collier Liddell, and started working in 1962. They left the Mississippi Delta where we were disenfranchised. So this was an ongoing build-up to Selma. And I mentioned that we had been to the Democratic Convention in 1964 asking for the right to vote. And so Selma was the culmination of all this work and litigation that had been taking place against the federal government for many years, because we had no protection at the polls. People were murdered. Mr. Lewis Allen was killed. Mr. Herbert Lee was murdered. Mr. Vernon Damon was murdered. Mr. Medgar Evers was murdered. I mean, many people I know were murdered as a result of trying to get the right to vote.
So at that point, did you fear for your life at taking part in those marches?
No, no. I'm not saying that to be foolish, but I had a mission, and it had to be fulfilled. I did not want to live as my ancestors had lived during slavery days and Jim Crow days. I would refuse to live that way.
Avis, and as you pointed out a moment ago, a lot has been done, a lot more needs to be done. Alabama has its first women congresswoman right now. Was that as a direct result of what happened at that time?
Yes, you know, that's what happens when you expand the franchise so that you can have representation that actually represents and looks like the people. So it's wonderful to see. But I have to say I'm in awe of the bravery of those who sacrifice their safety and sacrifice their lives to create opportunities that, quite frankly, would not be here if it were not for those actions. So I am just very grateful to be on the set today with one of those freedom fighters.
Stephen, when you were shooting this, sorry, you want to say something, Dory?
No, I'm humbled when I hear younger people say that, because it says that our work was not in vain.
Of course not.
And it was a mission that we were on. And as I said, I didn't want to live in slavery. My ancestors had been brought over here during the Middle Passage slaves. I didn't want to continue the Jim Crow ways, and I refused to participate in the United States of America's Jim Crow.
Stephen, when you shot those pictures of the marchers and the onlookers, did you at any point realize that you were shooting a pivotal piece of American history? Did you feel that you were recording history at that point?
Interestingly enough, I told myself as I was covering the march, this was history. But when you're in the midst of history in the making, it's very hard to feel that it's history because you're feeling it unfolding right before you. But yes, I knew that this was a unique march. It was a unique coming together of thousands of people from across the country to march with Dr. King. And we knew that this was going to make a change. We didn't know how the changes would affect themselves, but we knew that it was going to change America from that point on. And I wanted to get a sense of that pivotal point in history to not simply photograph the marchers, but the people who the marches were directed toward, the civilians, the bystanders, the ordinary workers who essentially would be enfranchised. And to capture them at this moment in time as they were watching the marchers proceed from Selma to Montgomery, to give a sense to a viewer, when they saw my photograph, that they were actually seeing this historic moment pass before their eyes.
Dory, to what extent do you think those television pictures that we saw of police beating marchers, beating the demonstrators, to what extent do you think that changed attitudes across the United States, indeed across the world, on what was happening in the South?
If I may go back, in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, people were beaten, dogs were put on people. This was nothing new. So this was just another day as far as we were concerned in the life of the United States. And we didn't know whether or not anything would come about as a result of that. I guess it was so horrible to the image that America was projecting. Birmingham had been shown with the dogs, and on the Selma Bridge, I refused to go across the Selma Bridge. SNCC refused because we weren't getting federal protection, and we had been subjected to brutality and murder all these years. So after the brutality that Sunday, we mobilized to join in solidarity with our comrades. We had no choice, but we wanted federal protection. I've known too many people who were murdered. I have it in my spirit. I can't, sometimes it hurts to even talk about Swerna, Cheney, and Goodman, our 3 workers who were murdered in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. And so I've faced a lot of brutality and a lot of murder. I was with Medgar Evers the night he was murdered in Mississippi, the field secretary for the NAACP, Mr. Vernon Damer, who was one of my mentors, Mr. Herbert Lee, who was shot by a state representative of Mississippi, shot down in cold blood in Liberty, Mississippi. Mr. Lewis Allen, who witnessed the murder, was murdered. Bob Moses, our executive director, was beaten. We faced a lot of brutality on the ground. We were the young radical people, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it wasn't that we were trying to be, we were young and mobile, and we had a mission. I'll leave it at that.
Avis, what did you make of the fact that when the Supreme Court started shredding up part of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, one of the things they said was that we don't need this any longer?
I think that they have their heads in the sand. They might as well be ostriches. And especially when Scalia said something to the effect of this is giving special rights to Black people. I mean, what did he just sort of teleport here from another planet? How can you live in this nation knowing the history that we've faced, knowing the bravery that so many of us had to exhibit just in order to get the basic human and civil rights that were supposedly born unto us as American citizens, and also knowing the present day actions that have occurred and continue to occur across this country to make it more difficult for people to be able to vote in America. It's completely diametrically opposed to reality. And I have to say one more thing. I believe that this onslaught, this new onslaught against voting rights in America is directly tied to the fact that the demographics of this country are changing. Right. In about a generation's time, this country will no longer be majority white. And so there is an element in this country that has made the political decision that if we cannot create a sort of agenda that appeals to the majority of the population, then we are then going to take steps into our own hands and eliminate the voting rights from those people in the population who will not be voting for us so that they can remain in power. It's a calculated move.
Okay, we will continue our conversation, but we are going to take a break right now.